September 14, 1984. The rugged coastline of Lincoln County, Oregon, stretched endlessly along the Pacific, its tide pools teeming with marine life that attracted students, researchers, and nature enthusiasts from across the region. On this particular autumn morning, the air carried the sharp scent of salt and seaweed as waves crashed against ancient volcanic rock formations. This was the domain of Michael Thompson, a 34-year-old tide pool guide whose knowledge of coastal ecosystems was unmatched in the area. Michael had spent the early hours leading a group of high school students through the intricate world of intertidal zones, pointing out sea anemones, purple sea stars, and hermit crabs navigating their rocky habitats. By noon, the students had departed with their teacher, leaving Michael alone to complete his routine survey of the area. His white van remained in the gravel parking lot overlooking the beach, keys still in the ignition, his jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." When Michael failed to return home that evening, his sister, Jennifer Thompson, contacted the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department. Deputies arrived at the coastal access point just after nightfall, finding Michael's van exactly as he had left it. His survey equipment, clipboards, and camera were missing, suggesting he had taken them on his usual route along the tide pools. Search and rescue teams were deployed immediately, combing the shoreline with flashlights as the tide rolled in, covering the very pools Michael knew so intimately. The initial investigation revealed troubling details. Michael Thompson was no amateur beachcomber. He had worked for the Marine Education and Research Center for over a decade, conducting hundreds of guided tours without incident. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict tidal patterns and weather changes. Colleagues insisted that Michael would never take unnecessary risks, especially not alone, and certainly not as evening approached with high tide imminent. Witnesses from the morning group reported that Michael had seemed distracted during the tour, frequently photographing specific tide pools with unusual intensity. One student recalled him muttering about patterns that didn't make sense, though at the time, no one understood what he meant. The teacher leading the group mentioned that Michael had declined their invitation to join them for lunch, saying he needed to document something important before the next tide cycle. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded. Coast Guard helicopters surveyed the waters. Volunteer groups walked every accessible stretch of beach. Divers explored underwater caves and rock formations. Yet Michael Thompson had seemingly vanished into the Pacific mist, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense that something more sinister than a simple accident had occurred along that desolate stretch of Oregon coast. The case began to reveal peculiar obstacles. Local authorities seemed strangely reluctant to classify the disappearance as suspicious, despite the unusual circumstances. Jennifer Thompson, a determined woman who refused to accept easy answers, pressed investigators to examine her brother's recent activities more closely. She knew Michael had been preoccupied in the weeks before his disappearance, often working late at the research center, making phone calls he wouldn't discuss, and filling notebooks with observations he kept locked in his desk. When Jennifer finally gained access to Michael's office at the research center, she discovered something that would haunt her for decades. His work desk had been cleaned out, files removed, photographs missing. Only a desk calendar remained, and on it, Michael had circled September 14th in red ink with a single word written beneath the date: evidence. The investigation gradually lost momentum. Without a body, without witnesses to foul play, and without clear evidence of criminal activity, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department had little justification to continue dedicating resources to the case. By winter of 1984, Michael Thompson's disappearance was officially classified as a missing person case, likely an accidental drowning, though his body was never recovered. The file was archived, gathering dust in a basement storage room where forgotten cases went to die. Jennifer Thompson never stopped searching for answers. She kept every newspaper clipping, every police report, every photograph of her brother. She maintained a detailed timeline of his final weeks, noting every unusual behavior, every unexplained meeting, every cryptic comment he had made. She knew her brother hadn't simply walked into the ocean. Michael had discovered something along that coastline, something significant enough to document obsessively, something that might have cost him everything. What Jennifer couldn't have known in 1984 was that the tide pools themselves were keeping Michael's secrets, holding evidence in their waters that would take nearly 4 decades and revolutionary scientific advances to finally decode. The ecosystem he had devoted his life to studying would ultimately become the key to understanding his fate, preserving a message written in chemistry and time, waiting for someone with the knowledge and determination to read what the ocean had been trying to say all along. Michael Thompson's life before September 1984 painted the portrait of a man deeply committed to environmental education and marine conservation. Born in Portland, Oregon in 1950, Michael had grown up visiting the coast with his family, developing an early fascination with the creatures inhabiting the narrow zone between land and sea. His childhood notebooks, preserved by his sister Jennifer, were filled with detailed sketches of sea stars, crabs, and anemones, accompanied by observations written in careful handwriting that revealed an analytical mind even at a young age. After earning a degree in marine biology from Oregon State University in 1972, Michael had returned to the coast, taking a position with the Marine Education and Research Center in Lincoln County. The center, a modest facility dedicated to public education about coastal ecosystems, became Michael's second home. He designed educational programs, led tours for school groups, and conducted independent research projects that, while not formally published in academic journals, were respected by the local scientific community for their thoroughness and insight. Colleagues at the research center remembered Michael as methodical and passionate, someone who could spend hours observing a single tide pool, noting the relationships between species, the effects of wave action, the subtle changes that occurred with each tidal cycle. He had a gift for making complex ecological concepts accessible to students, often using stories and metaphors that brought the intertidal world to life. Teachers regularly requested Michael specifically for their field trips, knowing their students would leave with genuine appreciation for marine ecosystems. In the months leading up to his disappearance, however, those who knew Michael best began noticing changes in his behavior. The transformation had started sometime in early summer of 1984. Michael began arriving at the research center before dawn and staying long after closing, often locking himself in the small laboratory space where he processed samples and developed photographs. His usually friendly demeanor became distant, distracted. When colleagues asked about his work, Michael offered vague responses about routine surveys and baseline data collection. Jennifer Thompson recalled visiting her brother in August 1984, just weeks before he vanished. Michael had seemed tense, preoccupied with something he refused to discuss in detail. He had mentioned conducting important research, but insisted it wasn't ready to share. When Jennifer pressed him, Michael had said something she would never forget, that some discoveries carried responsibility, and he needed to be absolutely certain before making accusations that could ruin lives and businesses. At the time, Jennifer had assumed he was being overly cautious about some ecological finding. Only later would she understand the weight of those words. Investigation into Michael's final weeks revealed a pattern of unusual activities that the initial police inquiry had overlooked or dismissed. Bank records showed Michael had made several trips to Portland, unusual for someone who rarely left the coast. Gas station receipts traced a route between Lincoln County and the state capital of Salem. Phone records from the research center showed multiple calls to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, the state's Environmental Protection Agency office, and even to a Portland law firm specializing in environmental litigation. More significantly, interviews conducted decades later with retired staff from the research center revealed that Michael had been collecting water and sediment samples from specific tide pools with unusual frequency during the summer of 1984. He had requested access to chemical analysis equipment typically reserved for formal research projects. When questioned about the purpose of his sampling, Michael had explained he was investigating potential contamination sources, though he never specified what kind of contamination or where it might be originating. A retired laboratory technician who had worked at the center in 1984 remembered Michael bringing in samples that showed unusual chemical signatures. The technician, speaking publicly for the first time in 2023, recalled that Michael had asked him to test for specific industrial compounds, including heavy metals and organic solvents. The results had alarmed both of them, showing concentrations that exceeded normal background levels. Michael had carefully documented everything, creating detailed maps showing which tide pools contained elevated contamination levels and which remained relatively pristine. What made these findings particularly significant was their geographic pattern. The contaminated pools weren't randomly distributed along the coast. Instead, they clustered in a specific area north of the main public beach, near a stretch of coastline that was less accessible and rarely visited by tourists. Michael had spent considerable time photographing not just the tide pools themselves, but also the cliff faces above them, the drainage patterns, and the rocky outcrops that suggested possible pathways for contamination to reach the intertidal zone. Jennifer Thompson's personal investigation uncovered another crucial detail. In the weeks before his disappearance, Michael had attempted to send her a package through the mail. She had received a notification card from the post office indicating a package awaited pickup. But when she had gone to collect it, postal workers claimed no such package existed. The notification card itself had subsequently disappeared from her possession during a break-in at her apartment in October 1984, though nothing else of value had been taken. At the time, police had dismissed it as a simple burglary, but Jennifer never believed in coincidences. Former neighbors of Michael's also came forward with information that hadn't seemed relevant in 1984. They reported seeing an unfamiliar dark sedan parked near Michael's home on several occasions in late August and early September. The vehicle would sit for hours, sometimes with someone inside, apparently watching Michael's residence. When neighbors had mentioned this to police during the original investigation, officers had suggested it was probably someone lost or waiting to meet another resident. No attempt was made to identify the vehicle or its occupants. Perhaps most troubling were Michael's own written records from that final summer. Jennifer had recovered a personal journal from Michael's home after his disappearance, though several pages had been torn out. The remaining entries painted a picture of growing concern and determination. Michael wrote about responsibility to truth, about the importance of protecting coastal ecosystems for future generations, and about the difficult position of having knowledge that powerful interests would prefer remain hidden. He never named those interests specifically in the surviving journal pages, maintaining a careful ambiguity that suggested he knew others might read his words. The final entry in Michael's journal, dated September 10, 1984, 4 days before his disappearance, contained a single paragraph that would take on chilling significance decades later. Michael wrote about being close to completing his documentation, about having nearly enough evidence to make his case compelling and undeniable. He mentioned planning to approach certain individuals one final time, giving them an opportunity to address the situation voluntarily before he took the information to regulatory authorities. He expressed hope that conscience and reason might prevail, though his words carried an undertone of doubt. What Michael Thompson had discovered along that Oregon coastline in 1984 had clearly been significant enough to change his behavior, to consume his final months, and possibly to cost him his life. The tide pools he loved and studied so devotedly were trying to tell him something, revealing secrets that someone, somewhere, desperately wanted to keep buried beneath the waves. And as the investigation would eventually prove, those secrets were still there, written in the water and sediment, waiting for technology and determination to finally bring them to light and deliver the justice that Michael Thompson had been seeking when he vanished into the coastal mist nearly 4 decades earlier. March 2023. Nearly 4 decades had passed since Michael Thompson's disappearance, and the Lincoln County coastline looked much as it had in 1984. The same volcanic rock formations jutted from the sand, the same tide pools filled and emptied with lunar precision, the same Pacific winds carved patterns in the beach. But the world of marine science had transformed dramatically, and with it came new tools capable of reading stories the ocean had been telling all along. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a 42-year-old marine biologist from the University of Washington, arrived in Lincoln County that spring with a research grant to study the long-term effects of climate change on intertidal ecosystems. Her project would document how rising ocean temperatures and changing pH levels were affecting the delicate balance of life in tide pools along the Oregon coast. The research center that had once employed Michael Thompson, now modernized and expanded, provided Sarah with laboratory space and access to historical records dating back to the facility's founding in the 1960s. Sarah approached her work with characteristic thoroughness, beginning with a comprehensive review of all previous research conducted in the area. She spent days in the center's archive room, scanning through decades of reports, surveys, and photographic documentation. The historical baseline data would be crucial for identifying changes in species composition, population densities, and ecosystem health over time. What Sarah didn't expect to find was a mystery that would redirect the entire course of her research. Michael Thompson's name first appeared in a 1982 research summary about seasonal variations in sea star populations. Sarah noticed the meticulous detail in his observations, the careful notation of environmental conditions, the systematic approach to data collection. Intrigued, she searched for more of his work, finding reports and photographs spanning his decade at the center. The quality and consistency of his documentation impressed her professionally. Here was someone who understood the importance of long-term ecological monitoring, who recognized that meaningful patterns emerged only through patient, sustained observation. Then Sarah discovered the gap. Michael's detailed records continued through the summer of 1984, growing more frequent and focused in those final months, and then abruptly stopped in September. A brief note in the center's administrative files explained that Michael Thompson had disappeared during a routine survey and was presumed to have drowned, though his body was never recovered. The matter-of-fact tone of the notation struck Sarah as oddly dismissive for the loss of a colleague who had clearly been dedicated and skilled. Something about the abrupt end to Michael's work bothered Sarah on a professional level. She began examining his final reports more carefully, particularly those from the summer of 1984. Michael had been conducting an intensive survey of specific tide pools in the weeks before his disappearance, returning to the same locations repeatedly, documenting them with unusual frequency. His photographic records from that period showed not just the pools themselves, but also the surrounding geography, drainage patterns, and cliff formations above the intertidal zone. Sarah decided to visit the exact locations Michael had been studying. Using his photographs and survey notes as guides, she made her way along the northern section of the coastline, a less accessible area that required careful navigation around slippery rocks and surge channels. When she reached the tide pools Michael had documented so extensively, Sarah began conducting her own preliminary assessments, collecting water samples and photographing the current state of the ecosystem for comparison with his historical records. The chemical analysis of Sarah's samples revealed something unexpected. Several of the tide pools showed trace levels of industrial compounds that had no natural source in marine environments. The concentrations were low, well below levels that would cause immediate concern for ecosystem health, but they were definitely present and definitely anomalous. More significantly, when Sarah tested pools in other areas along the coast, these compounds were absent. The contamination, though faint after nearly 40 years, remained concentrated in the same locations Michael Thompson had been studying so intensely before he vanished. Sarah's scientific training demanded systematic investigation. She expanded her sampling, creating a detailed map of chemical signatures across the entire study area. The pattern that emerged was striking and disturbing. The contaminated pools formed a clear geographic cluster centered on a section of coastline directly below a steep cliff face. Above that cliff, partially hidden by vegetation and erosion, Sarah could make out what appeared to be the remnants of old industrial infrastructure. Concrete foundations, rusted pipes, and gravel roads that had once serviced some kind of facility. Research into county records revealed that the site had indeed housed a chemical processing operation during the 1970s and early 1980s. Pacific Chemical Industries had maintained a small facility there, processing industrial solvents and metal treatments for manufacturing clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. The company had ceased operations in 1985, and the site had been officially decommissioned and remediated according to environmental standards of that era. Current property records showed the land had been sold to a development company and sat unused, awaiting permits for future construction. Sarah's discovery raised immediate questions. If Michael Thompson had detected contamination from Pacific Chemical Industries in 1984, that would explain his intensive sampling and documentation efforts. It would explain his contacts with environmental regulatory agencies and his apparent determination to gather comprehensive evidence. But it also raised darker possibilities about why a man who had spent years safely navigating those tide pools had suddenly disappeared without a trace at the very moment he was building a case against industrial pollution. The more Sarah investigated, the more convinced she became that Michael Thompson's disappearance was connected to what he had discovered in those tide pools. The contamination he had documented was still detectable 4 decades later, a chemical fingerprint preserved in the ecosystem he had devoted his life to studying. But if Michael had been ready to expose illegal dumping by a local industry in 1984, who had been motivated to stop him? And more importantly, what had really happened on September 14th of that year? Sarah made a decision that would transform her climate research project into something entirely different. She used social media and online directories to locate Jennifer Thompson, Michael's sister, who still lived in Oregon and had never stopped advocating for renewed investigation into her brother's disappearance. When Sarah reached out, explaining what she had found in the tide pools, Jennifer responded immediately. The two women agreed to meet, to share information, and to pursue answers that had been buried for nearly 40 years. Their first meeting took place at a coffee shop in Portland, away from Lincoln County and the research center. Jennifer arrived with boxes of materials she had preserved since 1984, police reports, newspaper clippings, Michael's journal, photographs, and her own investigative notes compiled over decades. Sarah brought her chemical analysis results, maps showing contamination patterns, and historical photographs comparing the tide pools in 1984 to their present condition. As they spread the materials across a corner table, both women realized they were looking at pieces of a puzzle that finally, after all this time, might be possible to solve. Jennifer revealed details that the original investigation had overlooked or ignored. She explained the missing package, the mysterious sedan watching Michael's home, the cleaned-out office, the pages torn from his journal. She described how local authorities had seemed reluctant to pursue certain lines of inquiry, how her attempts to push for more aggressive investigation had been gently but firmly discouraged. She spoke about the restraining order one local businessman had obtained against her in 1986, after she had repeatedly tried to question him about his company's waste disposal practices during the early 1980s. That businessman's name was Robert Carson, and in 1984 he had been the general manager of Pacific Chemical Industries. According to Jennifer's research, Carson had left the company shortly after it ceased operations, using his severance and savings to launch his own business ventures. By 2023, he had become a successful real estate developer and respected community figure, serving on local boards and donating to charitable causes. He was 78 years old, living in a mansion overlooking the ocean, seemingly untouchable and insulated by decades of careful reputation management. Sarah listened to Jennifer's story with growing certainty that they were on the edge of uncovering something significant. The tide pools that had preserved chemical evidence of industrial contamination might hold other secrets as well. Modern forensic science, environmental analysis techniques, and investigative tools that hadn't existed in 1984 could potentially reveal what had really happened to Michael Thompson. But they would need more than suspicions and circumstantial connections. They would need evidence compelling enough to force authorities to reopen a case that had been closed for nearly 4 decades. As Sarah and Jennifer prepared to leave the coffee shop, armed with new determination and a shared sense of purpose, neither woman fully grasped how dangerous their investigation was about to become. The secrets buried along that Oregon coastline had remained hidden for a reason, protected by people with resources, influence, and a vested interest in ensuring that certain questions were never answered. Michael Thompson had learned that lesson in the worst possible way. Now, nearly 40 years later, 2 women were about to discover that some truths, no matter how long buried, still carried the power to destroy those who sought to expose them. The alliance between Dr. Sarah Mitchell and Jennifer Thompson marked a turning point in the decades-old mystery. Throughout the spring of 2023, the two women worked systematically to build a comprehensive picture of what Michael Thompson had discovered and why it might have cost him his life. Sarah brought scientific rigor and advanced analytical tools, while Jennifer contributed historical context and institutional knowledge accumulated over 40 years of refusing to let her brother's case fade into obscurity. Sarah's first priority was expanding the chemical analysis of the tide pools. Using techniques that hadn't existed in 1984, she could now identify specific industrial compounds with remarkable precision, determining not just their presence, but their molecular signatures, which functioned like fingerprints linking contaminants to their sources. She collected samples from dozens of tide pools across a 2-mile stretch of coastline, carefully documenting GPS coordinates, tidal conditions, and proximity to potential contamination pathways. The results revealed something remarkable and damning. Certain species of algae and filter-feeding mollusks in the affected tide pools had absorbed industrial chemicals over decades, incorporating them into their tissues and shells in a way that created a permanent record of contamination. This biological archive showed that pollution hadn't been a one-time event, but a sustained pattern of dumping that had continued for years. The chemical signatures matched compounds used in industrial solvent processing and metal treatment operations, exactly the kind of work Pacific Chemical Industries had conducted. More significantly, Sarah discovered that the contamination pattern aligned perfectly with storm drainage systems and groundwater seepage pathways leading from the old Pacific Chemical Industries site to the tide pools below. The company's facility had been positioned on a cliff above the coastline, and waste products appeared to have been deliberately channeled down the slope, allowing them to drain into the ocean through the intertidal zone. This method of disposal would have avoided the cost of proper waste treatment while making detection difficult in an era when environmental monitoring was less sophisticated and systematic. Jennifer's contribution to the investigation proved equally valuable. She had spent decades cultivating relationships with former residents of Lincoln County who had worked in or around the industrial sector during the 1980s. Now, with concrete evidence of contamination supporting her long-held suspicions, some of these individuals were finally willing to speak openly about what they had witnessed. An elderly man named David Harrison, who had worked as a maintenance contractor for Pacific Chemical Industries, agreed to meet with Jennifer and Sarah at his retirement home in Eugene, Oregon. Harrison's account provided crucial context. He explained that Pacific Chemical Industries had operated on narrow profit margins, constantly seeking ways to reduce costs and maintain competitiveness. Proper disposal of chemical waste was expensive, requiring specialized treatment and transportation to licensed facilities. Beginning sometime in 1981, Harrison had noticed changes in the facility's waste management practices. Instead of waste drums being loaded onto trucks for off-site disposal, they were being moved to a storage area near the cliff edge behind the main building. Harrison had assumed the drums were being temporarily stored pending pickup, but he gradually realized they were disappearing during night shifts when most workers weren't present. On one occasion, Harrison had stayed late to complete repairs and had observed Robert Carson and 2 other managers moving drums to the cliff edge and connecting them to pipes that led down the slope. When Harrison had asked about the activity, Carson had explained they were conducting a drainage test for stormwater management. The explanation had seemed plausible at the time, but Harrison had noticed the drums were labeled as containing chemical waste, not water. The contractor had never reported what he saw, intimidated by Carson's authority and fearful of losing contracts his business depended on. But the memory had troubled him for decades, especially after Michael Thompson's disappearance became local news. Harrison had followed the case closely, reading newspaper accounts and wondering if the tide pool guide who vanished had discovered what Harrison suspected but had been too afraid to report. Now, nearly 40 years later, and with nothing left to fear, Harrison was ready to provide a statement about what he had witnessed. Armed with Harrison's testimony and the chemical evidence, Sarah and Jennifer approached the Oregon State Police, requesting that Michael Thompson's disappearance be reclassified as a potential homicide and formally reinvestigated. They presented their findings in a detailed report: the contamination patterns, the biological evidence preserved in tide pool organisms, Harrison's eyewitness account of illegal dumping, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Michael's vanishing at the exact moment he was building a case against Pacific Chemical Industries. The state police assigned Detective Amanda Torres to review the case. Torres, a 38-year-old investigator with experience in cold cases, recognized immediately that Sarah and Jennifer had uncovered something significant. She requested the original case file from Lincoln County and began conducting her own analysis of the 1984 investigation. What she found troubled her professionally. The initial inquiry had been superficial at best, failing to pursue obvious leads, neglecting to interview key witnesses, and accepting the accidental drowning theory with virtually no supporting evidence. Torres discovered something else that explained the inadequacy of the original investigation. In 1984, the Lincoln County Sheriff at the time had been a man named Thomas Bradley, who had held the position for 12 years. After leaving office in 1986, Bradley had joined the board of directors of several local companies, including a real estate development firm that Robert Carson had founded. The connection suggested a possible conflict of interest that might have influenced how aggressively the sheriff's department had pursued the investigation into Michael Thompson's disappearance. With authorization from her superiors, Detective Torres opened a formal investigation into the circumstances surrounding Michael Thompson's disappearance, now officially treating it as a suspicious death potentially connected to his environmental research. She began systematically re-interviewing witnesses from 1984, many of whom were now elderly but had clearer memories than the formal investigation had documented. Several individuals admitted they had felt pressured by local authorities to minimize or alter their statements about seeing Michael's activities in the days before he vanished. One particularly significant witness came forward voluntarily after reading a newspaper article about the reopened investigation. Patricia Morgan, now 72 years old, had been a secretary at Pacific Chemical Industries in 1984. She recalled Michael Thompson visiting the facility on September 12th, 2 days before his disappearance. Michael had arrived without an appointment, asking to speak with Robert Carson about chemical waste disposal practices. Carson had agreed to meet with him, and the two had spent nearly an hour in Carson's office with the door closed. When Michael left, he appeared upset, carrying a folder of documents he had brought with him. Carson, Morgan recalled, had been visibly angry, making phone calls immediately after Michael departed and speaking in tones too low for her to hear clearly. Detective Torres obtained a warrant to search property records for the old Pacific Chemical Industries site and the surrounding area. The search revealed something stunning. County surveyors had conducted geological assessments of the property in 1985, shortly after the company ceased operations. Buried in the technical reports was a note about an anomaly discovered during ground-penetrating radar surveys. The surveyors had detected what appeared to be a large, disturbed area of soil and rock approximately 50 yards from the cliff edge, in a section of the property that had been used for equipment storage. The anomaly had been noted but never investigated, dismissed as probably related to previous construction or utility installations. Armed with this information and growing evidence of criminal activity, Detective Torres requested authorization to conduct excavations at the old Pacific Chemical Industries site. The property's current owner, after being informed of the investigation, granted permission for the search. In late May 2023, forensic teams arrived with ground-penetrating radar equipment, cadaver dogs, and excavation tools. Sarah Mitchell and Jennifer Thompson were present, standing at a distance as investigators methodically searched the area identified in the 1985 survey report. On the third day of excavation, the cadaver dogs alerted to a specific location. Investigators carefully removed soil and rock, working slowly to preserve any potential evidence. At a depth of approximately 6 feet, they uncovered fragments of fabric and bone. The excavation continued with extreme care, revealing more remains along with several items that appeared to be personal belongings: a waterproof watch, corroded camera equipment, and metal portions of survey clipboards. Most significantly, they found a weather-sealed document case, the kind researchers used to protect papers in field conditions. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office for analysis, while the document case was carefully opened under controlled conditions. Inside, investigators found water-damaged but partially legible papers covered in plastic sheeting. The documents included chemical analysis reports, annotated maps of tide pools, photographs of drainage pipes, and handwritten notes detailing observations of illegal waste disposal. At the bottom of the case was a personal notebook, and on the first page, written in ink that had survived nearly 4 decades, was a name: Michael Thompson. Jennifer Thompson received the news at her home in Portland. After 40 years of searching for answers, she finally had confirmation of what she had always known. Her brother hadn't drowned accidentally or disappeared voluntarily. Michael Thompson had been murdered, his body hidden on the very property where the crime he had been investigating was taking place. The tide pools he loved had preserved the evidence of that crime, holding the truth in their waters and in the tissues of the creatures that inhabited them, waiting for science and determination to finally decode the message the ecosystem had been protecting all along. Detective Torres moved quickly to build a criminal case. The evidence was substantial but circumstantial, and the passage of 40 years complicated prosecution. However, the combination of forensic findings, witness testimony, environmental data, and documentary evidence created a compelling narrative of what had happened in September 1984. Michael Thompson had discovered illegal toxic waste dumping, confronted those responsible, and paid for his courage with his life. Now, nearly 4 decades later, justice was finally possible. But first, Detective Torres would need to prove not just that Michael had been killed, but exactly who had been responsible for his death and the decades-long cover-up that followed. June 2023. The Lincoln County Courthouse became the center of intense media attention as Detective Amanda Torres presented her findings to the district attorney's office. The evidence recovered from the Pacific Chemical Industries site had been processed through every available forensic technique, and the results painted a damning picture of what had occurred nearly 4 decades earlier. DNA analysis confirmed the remains were indeed those of Michael Thompson, ending any lingering doubt about his fate. But identification was only the beginning. The challenge now was building a prosecutable case against those responsible. The medical examiner's report revealed critical information about the circumstances of Michael's death. The skeletal remains showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, inconsistent with accidental injury. The location of the burial, the deliberate concealment, and the presence of his research materials all pointed to homicide rather than misadventure. Additionally, analysis of soil samples from the burial site showed chemical signatures matching waste products from Pacific Chemical Industries, suggesting Michael had been killed on or near the facility property and buried there shortly after his death. Detective Torres faced a complex challenge. The primary suspect, Robert Carson, was now 78 years old, a prominent community figure with substantial financial resources and political connections. Building a case against him required not just physical evidence, but also testimony from individuals who had knowledge of events from 1984. Many potential witnesses were elderly, and some had died in the intervening years. The investigation needed to move carefully but quickly, gathering statements before memories faded further or witnesses became unavailable. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Gregory Bennett, a 74-year-old retired chemical engineer who had worked as operations manager at Pacific Chemical Industries, contacted Detective Torres through his attorney. Bennett had been diagnosed with a terminal illness and decided he could no longer carry the burden of what he knew. Through his lawyer, he offered to provide testimony in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The district attorney, recognizing the value of insider testimony, agreed to the arrangement. Bennett's statement transformed the investigation. He confirmed that Pacific Chemical Industries had been illegally disposing of toxic waste through drainage systems leading to the coastal tide pools, a practice that had begun in 1981 and continued until the facility closed. Bennett explained that the decision had been driven by financial pressure, with Robert Carson arguing that proper waste disposal costs were making the company uncompetitive. Carson had personally designed the drainage system, using natural cliff formations and stormwater channels to make the dumping appear like runoff rather than deliberate pollution. According to Bennett, Michael Thompson had indeed visited the facility on September 12, 1984, requesting a meeting with Carson. Michael had presented evidence of contamination in the tide pools, including chemical analysis results and photographs documenting the drainage pipes. He had given Carson and the company 48 hours to voluntarily report the illegal dumping to environmental authorities and commit to proper remediation. Michael had made clear that if the company didn't act, he would take his evidence directly to state and federal regulators, along with the media. Bennett described a heated emergency meeting that occurred after Michael left the facility. Carson had gathered his senior management team, arguing that Michael's evidence would destroy the company and result in massive fines and potential criminal charges. Bennett claimed that Carson had stated they needed to prevent Michael from filing his report, though at the time Bennett had assumed this meant finding a way to discredit the research or negotiate a settlement. Bennett insisted he had not known Carson was planning violence, but he acknowledged he should have recognized the danger. The operations manager's testimony continued with events from September 14, 1984. Bennett had been working in his office that afternoon when Carson had summoned him and another manager, James Peterson, to a meeting. The three men had gone to the storage area behind the main building, where they found Carson standing near the cliff edge with Michael Thompson. According to Bennett, Carson claimed he had arranged a final meeting with Michael to discuss the contamination issue and try to reach an understanding before Michael contacted authorities. What happened next, Bennett stated, occurred in moments. An argument had erupted between Carson and Michael, with voices raised and accusations exchanged. Peterson had moved toward Michael, apparently trying to take the folder of evidence he was holding. Michael had resisted, and in the struggle, Peterson had struck him. Bennett claimed the blow had been harder than intended, causing Michael to fall and strike his head on the rocky ground. Carson had immediately checked for vital signs and declared that Michael was dead. Bennett's account described the panic that followed. Carson had made the decision to conceal what had happened, arguing that reporting the death would reveal the illegal dumping and destroy everyone involved. The three men had wrapped Michael's body and hidden it temporarily while they determined what to do. That night, after other employees had left, they had returned with excavation equipment and buried Michael in the disturbed area behind the facility, along with his research materials. Carson had taken Michael's vehicle and abandoned it at the coastal parking lot, attempting to make the disappearance appear as though Michael had been lost in the tide pools during his survey work. Detective Torres corroborated Bennett's statement through additional evidence and witness interviews. James Peterson, the manager who had allegedly struck Michael, had died in 2001, making him unavailable for prosecution. However, Peterson's widow confirmed that her husband had been troubled by something from his time at Pacific Chemical Industries, often experiencing nightmares and expressing guilt about unspecified events. She provided personal journals her late husband had kept, which included cryptic references to a terrible mistake and the burden of keeping silent about something that haunted him. The investigation also revealed systematic efforts to suppress the truth about Michael's disappearance. Detective Torres obtained records showing that Robert Carson had made substantial political contributions to Sheriff Thomas Bradley's re-election campaign in 1984, donations that had come shortly after Michael's death. Carson had also hired a private investigator to monitor Jennifer Thompson during her attempts to push for renewed investigation, documenting her activities and using that information to obtain the restraining order that had kept her away from him and his businesses. With Bennett's testimony, Peterson's journals, and the physical evidence from the burial site, the district attorney felt confident proceeding with charges. On June 28, 2023, nearly 39 years after Michael Thompson's murder, Robert Carson was arrested at his oceanfront home. He was charged with second-degree murder, conspiracy to conceal a homicide, obstruction of justice, and multiple environmental crimes related to the illegal waste disposal. The arrest sent shockwaves through Lincoln County, where Carson had been regarded as a pillar of the community. Carson's defense attorneys immediately moved to suppress evidence and challenged the prosecution's case on multiple fronts. They argued that the passage of time made fair prosecution impossible, that witness memories were unreliable after 4 decades, and that Gregory Bennett's testimony was motivated by malice and the desire for immunity. They portrayed their client as a successful businessman, being scapegoated for an industrial accident that had occurred when environmental regulations were less stringent and understanding of proper waste management was still evolving. The preliminary hearings attracted national media attention, with journalists and documentary filmmakers drawn to the story of a marine biologist whose murder had been solved through the very ecosystem he had died trying to protect. Sarah Mitchell found herself in the unexpected position of serving as an expert witness, explaining how the tide pools had preserved chemical evidence of illegal dumping, and how modern scientific techniques had decoded the environmental message Michael Thompson had been trying to deliver when his life was cut short. Jennifer Thompson attended every court appearance, sitting in the front row of the gallery, finally seeing the accountability she had fought for across 4 decades of her life. She had been 29 years old when her brother disappeared, a young woman who had refused to accept easy answers or official dismissals. Now, at 68, she was witnessing the legal system finally acknowledging what she had always known. Michael Thompson had been murdered because he had the courage to speak truth to power, to defend the natural world he loved against those who saw it merely as a convenient disposal site for industrial profits. As the case moved toward trial, Detective Torres continued investigating the broader conspiracy. She discovered that Pacific Chemical Industries had not been the only local industry engaging in illegal waste disposal during the 1980s. The tide pools held chemical signatures from multiple sources, suggesting a pattern of environmental crime that had gone undetected and unpunished for decades. The investigation was expanding, and more charges were likely forthcoming. But first, justice needed to be served for Michael Thompson, the tide pool guide who had disappeared trying to protect the coast he loved, leaving behind a message written in water and sediment, waiting nearly 40 years for someone with the knowledge and determination to finally read what the ocean had been trying to say all along. March 2024. The trial of Robert Carson began in a packed courtroom in Lincoln County, Oregon, bringing to conclusion a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 4 decades. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Catherine Hayes, presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and environmental data that together told the story of a murder motivated by greed and a decades-long cover-up maintained through influence and intimidation. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with testimony from over 40 witnesses. Dr. Sarah Mitchell explained to the jury how modern chemical analysis had revealed contamination patterns in the tide pools, creating an environmental record of illegal waste disposal that had continued throughout the early 1980s. She described how marine organisms had absorbed industrial compounds, preserving evidence in their tissues like a biological archive that had remained intact for nearly 40 years. Her testimony connected the environmental crime directly to Michael Thompson's research, establishing why he had been targeted. Gregory Bennett, appearing gaunt from his illness, provided the most damaging testimony against Carson. He walked the jury through the events of September 1984, describing the illegal dumping operation, Michael's confrontation with company leadership, and the fatal encounter that had ended with Michael's death. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys attacked Bennett's credibility and suggested his terminal diagnosis had made him willing to fabricate testimony for immunity. However, Bennett's account aligned closely with physical evidence and other witness statements, lending it credibility despite the defense's efforts. Forensic experts testified about the skeletal remains, explaining the evidence of blunt force trauma and the circumstances of burial. The presence of Michael's research materials with his body proved particularly significant, demonstrating that his death was directly connected to his environmental investigation. The weatherproof case had protected documents showing Michael had compiled comprehensive evidence of illegal dumping, including photographs of drainage pipes, chemical analysis results, and detailed maps marking contamination patterns in the tide pools. Jennifer Thompson took the witness stand to provide context about her brother's character and dedication to marine conservation. She described Michael's final weeks, his growing preoccupation with his research, and his determination to expose environmental wrongdoing despite apparent risks. She recounted the obstacles she had faced trying to investigate his disappearance, including the restraining order Carson had obtained against her. Her testimony personalized the case, reminding the jury that Michael Thompson had been not just a victim, but a dedicated scientist and caring brother whose life had been stolen. The defense strategy focused on creating reasonable doubt about Carson's direct involvement in Michael's death. Defense attorneys argued that even accepting Bennett's testimony, the fatal blow had been struck by James Peterson, who was now deceased and unable to defend himself. They portrayed Carson as someone who had made poor decisions in the panic following an unintended death, but had not himself committed murder. They suggested that concealing a body, while serious, was not the same as killing someone, and that Carson should not be held responsible for Peterson's actions. The prosecution countered by emphasizing Carson's role in creating the circumstances that led to Michael's death. The illegal dumping operation had been Carson's initiative, implemented to save money at the expense of environmental safety. When Michael threatened to expose these crimes, Carson had arranged the confrontation that ended in violence. Even if Carson hadn't struck the fatal blow himself, he had orchestrated the events leading to Michael's death and had actively concealed the crime for nearly 40 years, using his wealth and influence to evade justice. After deliberating for 3 days, the jury reached its verdict. Robert Carson was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, conspiracy to conceal a homicide, obstruction of justice, and multiple environmental crimes. While the jury had not convicted him of premeditated murder, they clearly believed he bore responsibility for Michael Thompson's death and the subsequent cover-up. The courtroom erupted with emotion as the verdicts were read, with Jennifer Thompson weeping quietly as nearly 4 decades of seeking justice finally reached conclusion. The sentencing hearing occurred 2 weeks later. District Attorney Hayes argued for the maximum penalty, emphasizing the calculated nature of Carson's crimes and his decades of deception. She noted that Carson had lived freely for 39 years, while Michael Thompson's family suffered without answers, while the environment Carson had poisoned continued bearing the scars of his illegal dumping, and while justice had been systematically denied through corruption and influence. Defense attorneys pleaded for leniency based on Carson's age and health, arguing that imprisonment would effectively be a death sentence for a 78-year-old man. Judge Maria Santos, a respected jurist known for careful deliberation, delivered a sentence that reflected the severity of Carson's crimes while acknowledging practical limitations. Carson received 15 years in prison for manslaughter, with sentences for the other charges to run concurrently. Given his age, the sentence meant Carson would likely spend his remaining years incarcerated. Judge Santos noted in her sentencing remarks that Carson's wealth and position had allowed him to evade accountability for nearly 4 decades, and that justice, though delayed, needed to be meaningful and substantial. Beyond the criminal trial, the case generated broader consequences. The Oregon Department of Environmental Quality launched a comprehensive investigation into industrial practices along the coast during the 1980s, discovering that Pacific Chemical Industries had been far from alone in illegally disposing of toxic waste. The tide pool contamination Sarah Mitchell had identified was part of a larger pattern of environmental crime that had gone undetected for decades. New remediation efforts were funded, and regulations were strengthened to prevent similar offenses. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Department conducted an internal review of the original 1984 investigation, acknowledging serious failures in how Michael Thompson's disappearance had been handled. While Sheriff Thomas Bradley had died years earlier, the review documented how his financial connections to Robert Carson had created conflicts of interest that compromised the investigation. The department issued a formal apology to Jennifer Thompson and implemented new protocols to prevent similar failures in future cases. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's climate research project evolved into something more significant. With grant support from environmental organizations, she established the Michael Thompson Memorial Tide Pool Research Program, dedicated to long-term monitoring of coastal ecosystems and training the next generation of marine biologists. The program emphasized both scientific rigor and environmental advocacy, honoring Michael's legacy of using knowledge to protect the natural world. Sarah continued her work on the Oregon coast, now with heightened awareness of how science could serve justice as well as understanding. Jennifer Thompson, finally able to properly mourn her brother after decades of uncertainty, organized a memorial service on the beach where Michael had last been seen alive. Colleagues from the Marine Education and Research Center, former students who had participated in his tide pool tours, and environmental advocates gathered to honor a man whose dedication to truth had cost him his life, but had ultimately led to accountability and change. a bronze plaque was installed at the coastal access point, commemorating Michael's life and work, ensuring his story would be remembered by future generations. The tide pools themselves became living monuments to Michael Thompson's legacy. The contamination he had discovered and died trying to expose was gradually remediated, though the chemical signatures would persist for decades as a reminder of past crimes. Researchers continued studying the intertidal ecosystem, building on Michael's meticulous documentation and recognizing him as a pioneer who had understood that environmental protection required not just science, but courage. The pools that had preserved evidence of his murder became symbols of nature's resilience and its power to reveal truth. In the end, Michael Thompson's story resonated far beyond Lincoln County, Oregon. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers whistleblowers face when exposing powerful interests, a reminder of how environmental crimes often remain hidden until someone brave enough to investigate pays attention to what the natural world is trying to reveal. It demonstrated how scientific knowledge, properly applied with modern technology, could solve cases that had seemed hopelessly cold, bringing justice even after decades of denial and deception. The tide pools continued their eternal rhythm, filling and emptying with lunar precision, teeming with life that adapted and persisted despite human interference. They had kept Michael Thompson's secrets for 39 years, preserving in their waters and sediments the evidence that would eventually expose his killers and vindicate his work. The message written in that coastal ecosystem had finally been read and understood, delivering justice to a man who had given his life trying to protect the natural world he loved. And in those pools, future researchers would continue Michael's work, studying, documenting, and defending the delicate balance of life that exists where ocean meets land. In the zone Michael Thompson had devoted his life to understanding and protecting.